Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tuesday Talks from the Gordon JCC. I hope that you all had a safe holiday weekend, and we're happy that you're here and watching. And today's a special day because we have a continuation of what we had, a popular show and request for our comeback scholar. Can I call you a scholar? Is that okay, Judy?
Why not?
All right, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to be discussing Jews in Hollywood Part 2, which, should be as fascinating as Part 1. And so let me just tell you, for those of you who weren't able to watch Part 1, you can go to our Gordon JCC YouTube page, and you can find the Part 1 of Jews in Hollywood. So you can watch that if you haven't already. But if you did not, let me give you a little brief bio of Judy. Judy Klass is from the New York, New Jersey area originally. She went to Sarah Lawrence College as an undergraduate. She was a Truman Scholar. She currently teaches at Vanderbilt University, English Department and Jewish Studies program. 8 of her full-length plays and 35 of her one-act plays have been produced. Her short plays have gone up all over the country, as well as England and Ireland. Her produced full-length play, Cell, was nominated for an Edgar and is published by Samuel French Concord. That's just a brief summary of Judy. She's very accomplished and knowledgeable, so we're really pleased to have her back today. And just a note that if you're listening and you have a question and you're watching on YouTube, you can write a question into YouTube and I will get it, so we can we can answer any questions you might have or any thoughts. We can address them. So please participate, because we love that. So I'm gonna turn the floor over to Judy, and let's see where today's conversation goes. Hi, Judy.
Hey there, how are you, Carrie?
I'm okay, thanks. Just getting back into the week after a nice long weekend.
Yeah, no, it was. No white pants after Labor Day, everybody.
Well, I don't know. I'm in fashion now. I kind of break the rules. And by the way, it was beautiful weather, so I hope everybody enjoyed that. Hope that you did. Did you do anything special, by the way?
I stayed in and tried to catch up on my courses, but every now and then I looked out the window and it looked pretty.
There's a scholar for you.
No, I'm teaching a course on Jews and music, and I sort of wrote the PDFs for it because there's no textbook that'll take you from Jerome Kern and Irving Berlin all the way through, Bob Dylan and Lou Reed and Billy Joel and modern people. So I sort of write PDFs, and then I can put a link to YouTube into them, because you can't really describe a song. So if you say, then George Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue and everything changed, it's very nice to have a link and they can actually hear it. But sort of tweaking those PDFs, I haven't taught the course in a while, and making sure there are YouTube links that work is just a hugely time-consuming thing. I love to do it, but it just sort of eats up my life when I teach this course. So that's a lot of what I've been doing, and I've been directing some of my plays on Zoom and sort of participating, like watching rehearsal with somebody else, because now that it's sort of plague time, all the theaters are closed, people are trying to reconceive some theater projects on Zoom. So I think that can be interesting.
So before we start, do you have an address where people can go online to not only learn more about you, but see your work or anything, that you want to share something so people can learn more about you?
Sure. Well, again, my website is www.judy-class.com. I used to have judyclass.com. I didn't understand all the rules when the internet started. Some company ate it and made it a hair care product, a Japanese hair care product company, and now it's for sale. And if I paid $1,000, I might get it back. Instead, I just have judy-class.com. And there are different things about songs I write and plays I write, full-length, short, fiction I write. You can look at different tabs there, and that's fine. And again, if anyone's looking for a play or a screenplay, talk to me, and then we'll see what we can do. Thank you for letting me do that.
You heard it first, folks, right?
Yep, there you go. Last time I did this, I sort of was scared. I was giving a talk and I had to present something first. So I sort of reread all the textbooks for my courses, which was great because I'm teaching Jews in Hollywood this fall. And in my terror, preparing for my last JCC talk, I really gave myself an overview of my course. It was a good refresher for right now when I'm teaching the Jews in Hollywood freshman seminar, or first year seminar, I should say. But this time I didn't do quite as much of that frenzied preparation, and I was scared, and I just had a Diet Coke. And so I think I was talking so fast, I sounded like I was on crack. I just was sort of spitting out information at you for half an hour at a stretch. I'm going to try to be a little more relaxed this time. I think I talked about the Hollywood studio system and sort of took people through World War II and different studios responding or not responding to the Nazi threat. And then once after Pearl Harbor, we got into the war, the studio moguls were so glad to sort of participate in the war effort, and they felt they had been fully vindicated as full-fledged Americans, even though they were immigrants. And then after the war, you had the House Un-American Activities Committee and McCarthyism, and a lot of writers and directors and some actors getting blacklisted, and the studio kind of gets the studio system breaking down, and the studio heads feeling scared and in some ways turning in people they'd worked with for years and not being so heroic about it. We didn't spend as much time talking about the era after that, which was an era of television and film and an era of independent filmmakers, both sort of auteurs, people who write and direct and sometimes act in their own movies, and other ways of making movies. We didn't talk as much about that. And we talked a little bit about appropriation and representation and who gets to write what and who gets to sort of speak in whose voice. There's more to say about that. And we also didn't talk a lot about sort of gender roles, perceptions of Jewish men, perceptions of Jewish women in the larger society, stereotypes that maybe some Jewish writers and filmmakers have reinforced. So those are all things that I thought, we could talk about today at a slightly less frenzied pace, and it might involve less focus solely on film, though I went off on tangents, and I would talk about shows like West Side Story, because very often a successful musical gets turned into a movie, and that may be the version of it that most people have seen anyway. So there's certainly connections to be made between different courses that I teach on Jewish humor, Jewish songwriters, which involves a lot with the musicals, and Jewish filmmakers. But I felt like this time there might be even more talk about those other fields. So
do you have a particular place that you would like to start? Or favorite, something that stands out to you as like kind of your favorite subject in here?
I don't know if one favorite. You always tell me choose one favorite. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, I never shut up. There are all kinds of things I could talk about. Yeah.
Just jumping
as a starting point. Well, as I say, so, during World War II, people stopped being visibly Jewish. Maybe not as much in the theater in New York. It was still, there'd be shows that might have some Jewish subject matter in the 30s, but certainly in Hollywood, you wouldn't have the Marx Brothers saying, 3 cheers for Captain Spaulding, the African explorer, and Groucho would say, did someone call me Schnorrer? Hooray, hooray, hooray. You might have that in a film in 1930, but you wouldn't have it in 32, 33. You wouldn't have little Yiddish jokes and in-jokes. And characters and actors who had Jewish names and played Jewish types got out of the movies. And some of that was maybe a good thing, because there were some really ugly ethnic stereotypes, not just of Jews, but of all different kinds of people in vaudeville. And those carried over into movies in the silent era in the 20s. And so maybe we don't miss those so much. It's good that they got rid of them in the 30s. But generally, you got rid of all representations of Jewishness. There were almost none in movies made during the 30s. And some of it was, the studios, again, were afraid that Germany, which was a big market for films, used to have a great film industry itself until the Nazis destroyed it. And a lot of those filmmakers from UFA came over to America. Germany wouldn't accept American films, and they still wanted to get films in that market. And it wasn't until the late 30s that they realized just how scary, just how anti-Semitic Hitler was. And again, Warner Brothers, before the other studios, sort of said, we don't want anything to do with Germany. They assaulted a representative of ours for being Jewish, and he wound up dying a few months later, and the heck with the Nazis. So, but that was one reason a lot of people sort of names disappeared from films, or certain kinds of representations disappeared from films. There was also growing anti-Semitism in America. There was a sense that if Jews made movies that were sort of antagonizing the Nazis, the Hayes office and the Breen office, the sort of the censors might say to them, you're getting political. We're not at war with Germany. You can't pick a fight with them. Americans might say, oh, look, the Jews are trying to get us into another war. Look at all the Americans who died in World War I, and now they want to drag us into another war in Europe. And rather than sort of make people rise up against anti-Semitism, it might provoke more anti-Semitism. So there were a lot of considerations involved. But anyway, after the 30s, in the 40s, you start getting, by the late 40s, anti-Semitism in America goes down. People start to understand the scale of what the Nazis did and how many people died in the camps once the camps were opened, and there was more talk about it. And sort of domestic anti-Semitism became much less fashionable. And so in the 40s and the 50s, you get movies like Gentleman's Agreement, Crossfire, movies about anti-Semitism. Interestingly, these films were not made by Jews. They were made by other studios and other people in Hollywood to a large degree. And there may be problems with them, but you get that, and you start getting really in the 50s and 60s representations of Jews again, and people start being Jewish in public again. You start getting musicals on Broadway, but then they wind up being movies like Funny Girl about Fanny Brice, with Barbra Streisand, like Fiddler on the Roof, a musical like Milk and Honey about sort of people from America going to Israel, and Harnick Bach, who wrote Fiddler on the Roof, did a show about the Rothschilds, and there was just more willingness to discuss Jewish subject matter. At the same time, you get these writer, director, or tour Jewish filmmakers. You get people like Woody Allen, you get Paul Mazursky, you get Sidney Lumet. Some of their films have Jewish content, Jewish characters. You get Philip Roth novels, and then in the 70s, they're turned into movies, usually starring Richard Benjamin, like Goodbye Columbus or Portnoy's Complaint. I would say that some of these things raise issues about how Jewish women are portrayed. And sometimes people will sort of say the stereotype of the Jap in movies and literature and this and that starts with Marjorie Morningstar. I rather like the Herman Wouk novel, Marjorie Morningstar. And I don't think it's a caricature of a Jewish woman. I think he's almost looking at novels about sort of, great romantic novels about women and sort of saying, why isn't there one about a Jewish woman? And that's why he wrote Marjorie Morningstar. Marjorie Morningstar, her real name is Marjorie Morgenstern. In the novel, she changes her name to Marjorie Morningstar, which is a translation of Morgenstern. That's the stage name she chooses. In the movie, the guy she's in love with names her that. But the guy she's in love with is a character named Noel Ehrman. I was just thinking, there's an essay by Letty Cotton Pogrebin, sort of called From Marjorie Morningstar to Dirty Dancing, in a book she wrote in the early 90s, where she sort of says, I'd go to the movies in Jamaica, Queens, and I'd look at the images of Jewish women, and they were all kind of horrible. And she sort of puts them in 4 categories. She said there was the Jewish mother, there was the Jap, there was the sort of the Jewish man's burden, the embarrassing Jewish wife, and then there was the sort of the big mouth troublemaker. And if you have to be one, you want to be the big mouth troublemaker, usually played by Barbra Streisand or something, or she puts Anne Frank in that category. But she says, life doesn't turn out so happily for them either. And why are these our only choices? And why do young Jewish women have no images in the movies where they say, this is someone I identify with, this is someone whose love story, I wish I was living a love story like that, this is someone who's heroic in a way I want to be heroic. Why is there sort of nothing? She goes after Marjorie Morningstar, but I think she's thinking of the movie, which was not a very good movie. Again, a character like Noel Ehrman, his name says a lot. His name, the character's original name is Saul Ehrman. He's a German Jewish family, and they look down on Eastern European Jews like Marjorie and her family. And it's spelled Saul Ehrman, Ehrman, maybe N, right? But he has Americanized that to Ehrman, spelled Airman, which makes it Luftmensch, all right? And his first name, because he wants to be a clever songwriter like Noel Coward and playwright, he's called himself Noel instead of Saul, but that's ridiculous because it sounds like Christmas. So in some ways, the man's name is Christmas Airhead. In some ways, he's named himself Christmas Airhead, which is an indictment of him. And we're not meant to say, oh yes, Noel Ehrman is right. Look at everything that's wrong with Marjorie Morningstar if he calls her a Shirley and he says, you're going to become your mother. He's sort of I think, a horrible person. I think woke kind of hates him and what he does to her life. So it's a much more complicated thing in the book than in the rather bad movie. But people sort of see that as the template for movies about the Jap, and they sort of see Noel Airman criticizing Marjorie Morningstar as a template for things that Alexander Portnoy or the guy in Goodbye Columbus would say about sort of a Jewish girl he'd date. And I don't think that's entirely fair to Herman Wouk, who just passed away at the age of, I don't know, 103 or 104. He'd been around since, 1915. He had a really good run. He was still writing interesting things till very late in his life, until his 90s. I don't think it's fair to Wouk, but you do get a lot of very ugly portrayals of Jewish women in the 60s and the 70s. And even Fiddler on the Roof, the matchmaker, Yenta, that character in traditional jokes about matchmakers and in traditional European culture, the matchmaker was always male, right? So to make it, to sort of say, we need another sort of Jewish woman to caricature. I mean, you've already got the wife Golda, who's sort of a scold. You've already got difficult Jewish women giving Tevye a hard time in that show, but they said, no, we need another one. Let's create this character called Yenta. I mean, that need to caricature Jewish women is striking, and it may come out of the fact that a lot of these things were being written by Jewish men who were trying to assimilate, who were marrying Gentile women and who were embarrassed about their parents and their family and their roots. And it may reflect their hostility, and it may reflect the fact that the 60s and the 70s were kind of misogynist anyway. I mean, there's a reason why the women's movement happened in the early 70s. It didn't happen in a vacuum. And there may be a reason why a lot of the early feminist leaders, and still some, are Jewish women. All of these things may be related, but those are some striking things that I wanted to talk about. Also, in terms of gender roles, there's something I talk about in my classes as a kind of Jewish camp. When we talk about theater, we talk about sort of campy gay shows that send up or deconstruct or satirize things that are considered American archetypes. This is the archetypal all-American man. This is the archetypal woman. This is the archetypal image of what's patriotic and what's good and what's true. And sort of camp sends it up and makes you ask questions about what is accepted as the wonderful thing. And I would say that, there were a lot of Jewish writers who contributed to the development of the American musical. Even though Jews are only 2% of the population, they wrote a lot of the great musicals and the great American songbook. And a lot of, people writing musicals were also gay, people like Cole Porter, but also a lot of the Jewish songwriters writing musicals. So they're sort of 2% of the population, but they're punching way above their weight in terms of the shows they created. But I would say that musicals, even though they're very commercial, even though they're very palatable, they're a kind of outsider art. So when we think of outsider art, we usually think of someone who's sort of on the autism spectrum, or someone who's sort of very different cognitively, who sort of spends a lot of time isolated, creating some really unusual work that we're not sure how to assimilate, But so we don't think of something as sort of carefully crafted and sort of meant to appeal to people as a musical. But I think we can also look at musicals as outsider art, and whether the people writing them are gay or not, I think there's a certain Jewish camp to a lot of the musicals, a sort of an outsider's lens on American culture, and also gender roles, because I would just argue that Jewish gender roles are a little bit different. Sorry, go ahead, Carrie, what were you going to ask? I can't hear you. I can't tell if you're muted or I have my sound down.
I'm good. I'm trying not to interrupt.
Okay.
It's so fascinating where you're going. All I could think of right now as you're speaking is like Mrs. Maisel. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I am in such bad shape. I have never watched Mrs. Maisel, and that's I'm not teaching Jewish comedy right now, but it's inexcusable. I need to sit down and binge watch the show. Yeah. I'm not sure how I will like it. I mean, I have students who love it. I'm afraid, like the Goldbergs, which is again very different from Molly Goldberg and the show The Goldbergs that Gertrude Berg created back in the day. She may have invented the sitcom with that show. I don't like a lot of shows. I find them cartoony and gross, and I find the representations one-dimensional, and I feel like they're trying to act very sophisticated by going for shock value. And it may just be that I'm old and grumpy, and I don't know. I'm afraid, but maybe I'll love it. Maybe I'll absolutely love Mrs. Maisel. But I think it probably engages with some of these questions, and with the sort of the "take my wife, please," you know, the Shecky Green kind of, you know, the that kind of male-dominated Catskills humor, and the way women appeared in it. And the idea of a show where a woman takes that on is certainly interesting to me. But I haven't seen it. But I would say, I mean, just in terms of TV representations recently, I'm not a big fan of the Mrs. Wolowitz character on The Big Bang Theory. I mean, I'm sorry that actress died, but I never thought it was one of the fresher, more interesting things the show did. I felt like, oh, you know, that's a Jewish, I mean, she never appears on camera, but she's described and she's grotesque, and she's, you know, that's sort of, when I was growing up, that was the portrayal of Jewish women as Mrs. Wolowitz, and it happens much less now. And I don't miss that kind of constant representation of Jewish women.
So when do you think was the turning point? And yeah, when would you say is the turning point?
From what to what?
From more of a stereotype portrayal of Jewish women. Or
I don't know.
there has been?
I don't know that it's gone. I mean, we still have far more movies made by men writing the screenplays, men directing, you know, where 80% of the time we're focused on male characters. There still aren't a lot of plays or movies that pass the Bechdel test, you know, where you sort of have two women talking to each other and they're not fighting over a man, they're talking about something else, right? That's a really simple test. You have a lot of movies where two men might talk to each other and they're not like, I love her, you can't have her, I love her more, right? There are a lot of things that would pass a test like that. There are almost no movies and plays and other things where women characters do that. So again, I'm not watching as much TV as I should, given that I teach pop culture. I don't really know broads. I don't really know girls. I know people like, you know, Lena Dunham have come along, and there are women like Amy Schumer, and she's writing movies as well as, you know, had a TV series. So I think there's more. I think there are far more images now of Jewish women playing romantic leads and having friends and having lives of their own and being the focus of a show, you know, and Sarah Jessica Parker's half Jewish, and she, you know, and Sex and the City. And I don't follow all these shows. I think there are more things focused on women and their concerns than there were before the year 2000, you know, by the 90s or the early 2000s. I still don't think there was a lot. I think from the 60s and 70s on, there were a fair number of men who were identifiably Jewish men, male leads who could be the romantic lead, who were sympathetic characters who you were rooting for through the show or the movie. I think now there are some women, not as many as perhaps there should be, because there just aren't, you know, that many stories about women being told. And there's probably more on TV than in film. You know, that's probably what I would say. But I mean, in terms of also, so anyway, this camp thing though, I think that gender roles among Jews are culturally, I'm not saying biologically, race, no, you know, no one who knows, right? Exactly what Jews are, an ethnic group. I mean, it's all semantics almost. I think they're a little different than traditional European and American culture, and a little more androgynous. There is a woman named Dr. Deborah Tannen, who wrote a book, You Just Don't Understand Men, Women, and Conversation. And it sort of sounds like a Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus kind of book, but I think it was a better book. She's a sociolinguist, and she drew on real studies, and she'd really looked at this stuff. And she looked at just sort of how people use language. And her thesis was that men and women are almost engaging in cross-cultural communication, because little girls grow up playing with little girls and little boys grow up playing with little boys, and they're socialized differently, and how they use language in their groups is different, so that when they then get together in a heterosexual couple, each one thinks the other person is doing something terrible, and it's just that they're from two different cultures. And if they look at it that way, they can work their problems out better. And so she says men use language to prove themselves. And if men are out in public, if they're in a class, if they're in a lecture, if they're in a negotiation, if they're with a group of friends, they use language to show I'm strong, I'm smart, I'm confident, I'm knowledgeable, right? That's how you prove yourself. And then when they come home, they want to just be able to relax. They don't have to prove themselves anymore. They don't have to use language. They don't have to talk. Whereas women grow up often with just a best friend, and they trade secrets and they braid each other's hair, and it's sort of reciprocal stuff. And so for them, language is sort of part of the intimacy of friendship. Language is what you share with someone you're really close to. So they might not speak up as much in class and at the workplace, but then when they get home, it's like they're back with their best friend and they can trade secrets.
We lost your sound for some reason. So,
uh-oh.
And then you're back. Okay.
Am I back? Okay, what was I saying? Here, I said I was gonna be talkless, and now I don't.
They're quieter. They have the friendships.
Okay. Okay. So women grow up with a best friend, so they don't feel that they're not trying to use language to prove themselves in the public arena. They wait till they get home, till they're with the person they value most, to finally be able to talk. Home is where you can relax and talk, and it's a sort of an intimate thing with someone you're really close to. And they get home and their husband just wants to watch the game or read the newspaper, and they're furious and they feel, you don't love me, you don't value me. And she would say, it's not that the man's wrong, it's not that the woman's wrong, it's that it's cross-cultural communication, or miscommunication. She said men use language more in public, women use it more in private. She said, except for Jews who use it everywhere, both men. And I was reading that, and I was like, you can't say that in the middle of this thing. You can't generalize. And then I think, yes, she can. If I've always been the noisiest kid in my class, noisier than a lot of the guys. Look at me. I said I was going to be quiet. I haven't shut up since this thing started. So I think there are a lot of women who are strong, confident, a lot of Jewish women comedians, a lot of sort of Jewish women in public life who are using language the way men traditionally do. And then there are a lot of Jewish men who might come home and complain about their day or gossip about some crazy person in the workplace and use language more the way women do in traditional European or sort of WASP American culture. It's just the cultural difference, and it reads as androgyny. And you have a tradition of Jewish men often studying Talmud and spending all day studying, and their wives going out and earning a living so that they can study all day. And that makes for sort of strong, confident women and men who are maybe they're not Luftmensch, but they're dreamy and they're less practical and they're less earthy. And their wife has to say, hey, reality check. And that might be built into the culture. And so that's at odds with the European way of doing things. So in the late 1800s, you had sort of experts in Europe when they were sort of coming up with psychology, but you also had a lot of people into eugenics and social Darwinism and twisting scientific ideas into pseudo-scientific ideas and saying, Jewish men are hysterical. And the term hysteria has a female association, right? I mean, same root as hysterectomy. It's like an inflamed uterus caused this hysteria, they used to think, right? So this idea that Jewish men are neurotic, they're hysterical, they're more of them are gay, which 120 years ago was a huge indictment, and they treated it like it was some sort of psychopathology. And there's just a way of sort of seeing Jewish men as wrong or weird, and mixed with a scholar named Sandra Gilman would say European men were doctors, scientists were freaked out by the whole idea of circumcision, and they saw it as both making Jewish men less masculine, but also somehow sexually aberrant or deviant or dangerous. Sandra Gilman has written about how the London police just assumed Jack the Ripper must be a Jew, with basically no evidence. They just decided, it must be a Jew in London who's doing this. And there's a guy named David Chack who drew on Gilman getting back to movies, and I will still sometimes get back to movies. Because he talks about the early movie Scarface, starring Paul Muni, whose real name was Muni Weisenfront. He came out of the Yiddish theater, and Howard Hughes, and the way of presenting Scarface as this dangerous, aberrant, he's supposed to be an Italian-American immigrant, but these new immigrants who are coming in and changing America, and these new cities and the violent crime, and it sounds like the way people talk now, but the way Scarface was presented almost caricatured. And Paul Muni didn't like the way he was treated by Howard Hughes and didn't want to, it had a screenplay by Ben Hecht. I'm not saying he wasn't Jewish or there weren't other Jewish people involved, but he wound up sort of saying, I don't want to make a movie for Hughes again. And this guy David Chack gets a little carried away with, he almost sort of say the whole idea of Scarface, he almost presents him as this sort of circumcised penis walking around and having gangster problem. I mean, I'm exaggerating the article, but this idea that he's somehow sort of marked and grotesque and not quite a person, and sort of sexually interested in his sister, and there were sort of a lot of weird images, and some of them Jews internalized and would present, and this idea of Jewish men as, I would just, when I talk about Jewish camp, if there's a movie called Whoopi starring Eddie Cantor, and I think I sent you, Carrie, an article that talked about that. It talked about Whoopi and Girl Crazy. I mean, it also talked about the jazz singer, and it talked about Jews in blackface. It talked about all kinds of things. It came from, you were just talking about someone who met Willie Howard, and so the article talked about that, but it came from this book by a woman named Andrea Most called Making Americans, Jews in the Broadway Musical. We have Ethel Merman on a motorcycle there, I guess, and Annie Get Your Gun on the cover. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but you can find it. But she has some really interesting thoughts on these things too. And this show, Whoopi, which was a Broadway show, which was then filmed in 1930, and Eddie Cantor plays this hypochondriac who's gone out west for his health, but he doesn't help his health, and he's not really sexually interested. He's got a nurse named Nurse Custer, who's sort of almost like a dominatrix, and she's constantly making passes at him and sort of picking him up and throwing him down and giving him pills and demanding love from him. And he's just sort of not, it's sort of a coded way of saying, in the midst of cowboys, this Jewish man, the humor is this Jewish man in the midst of cowboys in the Old West, and how completely he doesn't belong there. But it's not that far removed from a movie like City Slickers, with Billy Crystal and a bunch of other Jewish guys going out to the West, and Jack Palance is trying to show them how to be manly men and cowboys, and it doesn't go so well. In some ways, there's always humor intrinsic in, you take a Jewish man or you take a Jewish woman and you put them in a hyper masculine or hyper feminine environment. So you have Irving Berlin in the army, and he really was in the army when he wrote "Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning," and it's this kvetching song that comes out of World War I about how he hates reveille and how he hates getting up, and it's just this whiny song. It's wonderful. I love it, but it's funny. Just the whole idea of Irving Berlin standing there like a little schnook in his World War I uniform, and he wears it in the movie. This is the army that was made during World War II, to raise money for the army. But Barbara Streisand is playing Fanny Bryce in the Ziegfeld Follies, when Mr. Ziegfeld says you have to sing this song about I am so beautiful, and you see all these Ziegfeld girls putting on this inane number, right? And then Barbara Streisand shows up and she's put a pillow under her dress so she looks like a pregnant bride. It's about all the different brides in different times of year. And it's sort of a camp send-up of the Ziegfeld Follies and those representations of women. And I would say it's Jewish camp, not gay camp. So that's sort of what I'm talking about, is that Jews are a little more androgynous, or their gender roles are a little different from the mainstream, and that causes them in some of the works that they write to deconstruct or to find humor in what other people just accept unquestioningly.
So two people are coming to mind, and I would love to have your thoughts on. Of course, when you talked about neurotic and hysterical, I think of Woody Allen. I mean, I always say I'm like the female Woody Allen, when I just describe myself, but because I can identify with that, with that kind of totally neurotic type of mentality about, I'm going to get, every time I have a little, what is that? If I have cancer, like every friggin' thing, and that hysterical kind of aspect. And I say that in a funny, loving way about myself, but it's also, he hits on something that to me is very, like, it is Jewish, or it's the way I have been brought up Jewish. But regardless of myself, what are your thoughts on him in his place in the whole film world?
Okay, well, I mean, I talked in the last talk about how things got really interesting in the spring of 2019 when I was teaching Jewish humor with a lot of politicians with blackface pictures in their yearbooks, and Al Franken, who I never had trouble teaching Al Franken before and showing them clips of him on SNL and reading to them from his book, Rush Limbaugh is a big fat idiot. And all of a sudden he was being publicly, castigated and cast out in a way that really troubled me. I mean, we talked a little last time about cancel culture and
right.
social media and all these things. And I was very upset with people I admire for the way they handled Senator Al Franken. I was absolutely furious. So a lot of people I generally had admired for the way they behaved. And and the same thing that term with Dylan Farrow going on Gayle King and trying to say to my students, I have problems with whether to show Tootsie, because I now think Dustin Hoffman is creepier than I ever knew he was, or in a Jewish humor class. Or there are people I wrestle with. Should I show a clip from this film? Should I this or that? It's possible that neither Al Franken or Woody Allen are predators, and this just came up in my Jewish songwriters class the other day when we were looking at the Gershwins and we listened to Rhapsody in Blue. And I decided to show my class the beginning of the Woody Allen movie, Manhattan. Because he makes brilliant use of Rhapsody in Blue at the very beginning of that film. He just uses it. It's a wonderful thing to use if you're making a movie about the city of New York, and he's sort of voiceover chapter 1. But, meanwhile, he's playing Rhapsody in Blue and showing these different scenes of the city. And it's great. And I said to them what I say to my other classes: I'm not sure Woody Allen's a sexual predator. And I see some students glaring at me and I wonder, has this person now written off my course? They could have enjoyed it. They could have, but they've just been turned off and they decide that I'm giving a predator a pass. So it's a real question, and then in things like the Jewish film class, I have to include Woody Allen, and I'm not going, so I say, during the custody battle between Woody Allen and Mia Farrow, there were two sort of official investigations into the allegations that he had sexually abused his daughter. Teams of psychologists, they interviewed the kid, and they said, we don't think that there was molestation. And one of them said, we think there was maternal coaching. We think Mia Farrow, coached her daughter to say these things, and a child can grow up thinking she was molested if she wasn't. During the, I don't know, was it the 80s when you had all those issues with daycare centers where people were saying these daycare centers were some dens of iniquity and they were molesting the kids, and kids were saying, and then the teacher turned me into a mouse, and then, they took me into a subterranean dungeon, and there was no, basement, and eventually when the teachers who ran that daycare center were let out of prison after several years because there was no real evidence against them, some kids were outraged because they remembered being molested because the lawyers had told them that they were molested and had described, graphic things that they'd never even heard of as children. And that became part of their sense of their lives and what had happened to them. And so I just think it's a really tricky, dangerous thing. I just read Woody Allen's autobiography, Apropos of Nothing, which he finally got published. I enjoyed it a lot. And he said, he doesn't disparage the Me Too movement. Al Franken doesn't disparage it, but he said it's wrong to say women never lie. He said, tell it to the Scottsboro boys. And he's right. So I still teach Woody Allen. I have colleagues and students who think that's terrible. And I don't know what to say to him, but I do. I would say a movie like Annie Hall, which is my personal favorite. I'm not that unusual in that. It's a different kind of romantic lead. It is someone who's a hypochondriac, who's not neurotic, who's not the classic American male archetype, but he's still a convincing romantic lead and a sympathetic character. But the kind of humor I'm talking about, where you take a Jewish person and you put him in a hyper-masculine environment and it's funny, Woody Allen in Take the Money and Run as a gangster is funny. Woody Allen in Bananas, sort of as part of a revolution in a Latin American country, though I have some issues with him becoming the head of the country, and because I've studied Latin America and I have issues with that kind of stuff, but there's humor there. Woody Allen in the Russian Revolution, fighting, being forced to be in the army to go fight Napoleon is funny. I mean, these are not contexts where he belongs. So, that was in Love and Death. I don't know if I said Woody Allen sort of playing Buck Rogers in Sleeper, and he's got to sort of lead the science fiction revolution in the future. It's funny. These are not, Woody Allen in Play It Again, Sam, where he's trying to be like Humphrey Bogart. He's trying to be like a Warner Brothers gangster from the 30s and 40s. The joke is that he is just so absolutely, ill-equipped to be playing that kind of role, So I think that ties into what I was saying about Jewish camp and humor coming out of the distance between some of these people and the roles that they're expected to play. There's a moment in, again, that Barbara Streisand playing Fanny Brice, where all the Ziegfeld girls are around her and she's going, I am so beautiful. And she sees they're sort of in their scanty outfits and she looks at them and she's like, like this person's a space alien. And it's just sort of, what am I doing here? And what are these strange creatures all around me? And I think you get that in a lot of musicals and also a lot of movies. So does that answer your question about Woody Allen?
No, I mean, that he's definitely a hot topic. I mean, I I feel like you just mentioned his name and you have like people going, scattering to two different sides, where they're at. And it was, I really appreciate your take on it, on him. And yes, and then the other person that came to mind while you were speaking, which, she's not a film, she's an act, well, I don't know, she's really just a comedian, she's a comedian, but she's iconic, is Joan Rivers. Mm-hmm. And do you ever discuss her in any of your classes and her role in the Jewish women world?
Oh, sure. And in the Jewish humor course, I recommend people read, just in terms of what I was saying, the Jews talk everywhere, what Dr. Tannen said, generally women speak more in private, men speak more in public, Jews speak everywhere. She has an autobiography called Enter Talking. Almost any of these Jewish celebrities that we're discussing could have called their autobiography Enter Talking. Jews are very verbal, and people say that Eskimos have 50 words for snow. I think Jews have more words for, kvetching, kibitzing, a spiel, schmoozing somebody. They have more words for different ways of talking, going into a shtick than maybe any other culture in terms of Jewish words that have come from Europe and entered English. I think a lot of them have to do with talking and using language. Joan Rivers is absolutely fascinating because in some ways it's a feminist story. Again, in the midst of all these sort of Henny Youngman, Shecky Green guys sort of making jokes about their wives and the mud pack on her face and giving her money. And, I bought her a funeral plot and for our anniversary last year. And she said, what are you getting me this year? And I'm like, you haven't used what I gave you last year, and that kind of thing, but that kind of humor about Jewish women and coming into that environment and making it as she did and finally getting on the Tonight Show and charming Johnny Carson and then being castigated by Johnny Carson because she dared to want to take over the Tonight Show when she was their most successful guest host. There are a lot of really interesting things and admirable things about Joan Rivers. And at the same time, there's a lot of her jokes are self-deprecating and self-loathing. And so are a lot of Jewish men's. I'm not saying they're not, but especially Jewish women are meant to put themselves down to a degree that can be disturbing. And her just incredible hostility to other women, and I didn't watch Fashion Police that much, and any stupid reality show she was on. She would do anything. Once her husband, died, killed himself and had lost the money, she was going to take care of herself and she was going to take care of her daughter. And she and Melissa were going to be all right and they were going to be famous again. And the tenacity, like a mama lion with which she did that, I have to salute it. And she was always the freshest, most energetic, funny thing in any of these silly shows, that she'd get on. But just the way she'd go after other women. And it was I read her autobiography and it's just there are strange dynamics there. I just think she's fascinating.
She's like, it reminds me of Howard Stern. Not Howard Stern, sorry.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, that's funny. I said Howard Stern, but I was thinking of American Idol, and he's not Jewish, but how he would go after people.
Yes. Simon
Cowell, like mean, like, whoa, it's hard to watch sometimes, but at the same time it makes for like, strong ratings because You're like, what are they going to say next? When Joan Rivers, for the 100th, I had just started working at the Gordon JCC and they brought Joan Rivers. We had Joan Rivers for the 100th anniversary for their big fundraiser for the evening. And I love Joan Rivers. I really just, I was so excited. And there was a mixed reaction that night. It was a packed house, but there was a mixed reaction to her. You can almost say vulgarity in a way, but I thought it was hysterical, and I'm from New York and I have a whole different sensibility, I think, sometimes than like a Southern sensibility. And, so it was interesting to see her in that environment, actually, and I do have a book signed by her from that evening. And I've always loved her, but I understand what you're saying, on Fashion Police and stuff. But fashion's a whole, well, I don't know. I kind of
It's
enjoy
meant to be a show where people are attacking people, but she's, you know, she would go after, the way she'd go after Elizabeth Taylor, whoever, but that was because when she was a little girl, Elizabeth Taylor was considered beautiful, was a movie star, and she just wanted to be where Elizabeth Taylor was. And she went through years where she felt she was heavy and puts herself down. And so then any woman who gets heavy, she would put down the same way. And she just, I mean, she just, the way she was scarred, I think, in some ways by things she'd gone through. But when she died, I was very, very sad. And that stupid doctor who just unnecessarily, because her mind was as sharp as she could have kept going for, I don't know, 10, 20 years. And
Oh, yeah.
I remembered reading an interview with her like a couple years earlier where they said to her, "What do you think your last words will be?" And she said, "It was a joke. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. I didn't mean it. I was joking." I mean, Joan Rivers she was very, very funny. And being a kid, when she would take over the Carson show for months at a time, when he would be on vacation, and there's a woman hosting the Tonight Show at a time when women never got to do stuff like that. And she would just sort of camp out and hang out with Boy George, and they'd gossip, and it was lovely. I mean, I was very fond of Joan Rivers. At the same time, I'm glad I never heard Joan Rivers critique me or my look or my, you know, I mean, I never met her. It's fine. You know,
Did you see the documentary they made about her? It was at the Belcourt, and
A Piece of Work, Joan Rivers, A Piece of Work.
where I guess that was a name. I don't recall. I'm not. My mind is
Yeah,
not like yours. I could tell you that.
Well, I teach this stuff, so it helps, you know.
She, to see the other side of her, how, you know, she was so what's the word? Where, I mean, she would be delivering meals to people. What's the word?
She could be altruistic. She could be kind. She could be generous. But I think she had a strange childhood with very different parents. Her father was funny. Her mother wasn't, but she spent a lot of time with her mother. I don't know. I mean, I think she's an interesting figure, but very, very complicated figure. I had Vanderbilt buy that film, and I recommend students watch it and write a paper about it if they want, if they're interested in her, as well as read her biography, her autobiography.
And so when it did, you know, I mentioned before when I mentioned Howard Stern, and it came out just out of left field, but what is your take on Howard Stern?
Again, I don't like, there's a kind of an ugly, amoral, I don't really like uncomfortable humor. I don't like really mocking people. So I'm not, and I'm, you know, I'm teaching Jewish comedy, and a lot of Jewish, you know, I'm not that big on Curb Your Enthusiasm because it's just so much uncomfortable humor, even though Larry David is, you know, funny and accomplished, and you know, I didn't even watch Seinfeld that much. I mean, I'm a bad person in some ways to teach Jewish humor. I know some of this stuff, so I've heard Howard Stern say insightful, interesting, smart, funny things, and I've just heard him be kind of an ugly pig, and it's not really, maybe in some ways I'm uptight or prudish or fussy or something, but it's not my kind of stuff. I would say another way that Jews are androgynous is that, I mean, another way that Jews, I think, are a little culturally different from Europeans and the Americans who were here before the Jews came over in large waves in the 1890s, is Jews are less buttoned down about sex. You know, there's the old joke where the cowboy's marrying a Jewish woman, and he said he's going to convert, and he's having lessons with the rabbi, and he's saying, "Rabbi, you know, if once I'm married to my wife, can we pretend that, you know, she's my horsey and I'm the cowboy?" And the rabbi says, "Look, whatever you want to do. I'm not even sure I want to hear about it." He says, "And, you know, there's a big pasture behind my house. Could we have sex outdoors under the," and the rabbi says, "Look, if it's your pasture, I guess, if you want to, you know," and he says, "So we can just do it anywhere, on the kitchen table, you know, lying down, standing up." And the rabbi says, No, this you must never do. You must never have sex standing up. And he says, well, why? And the rabbi says, because there is a chance if you have sex standing up, it could lead to dancing, you know. But this idea that the Jews don't see sex in and of itself as a bad thing, you know, whereas there's a sense that even that sex is intrinsically dirty I think in a lot of Christian culture, and it isn't for Jews. So you get people like Sophie Tucker, you get a lot of these Jewish women, you get Dr. Ruth, you get Sigmund Freud, you get Jews being more blunt about sex and more earthy and frank about sex. You get Joan Rivers talking about, you know, sex with her husband or whatever. And it sort of led the way culturally. But it's also in some ways a cultural difference, and certainly with women, different from the way other women were behaving 100 years ago. And I'm not saying every woman was talking like Sophie Tucker in 1920. I think a lot of Jewish women were very religious women who were very modest, and they saw her as a whore, and they, you know, wouldn't want anything to do with her. But there is a frankness and an earthiness and a vulgarity to some aspects of Jewish culture that was very different, especially with women, from the mainstream. So those were some of my thoughts. You know, I mean, I could talk about actors in Hollywood. I could talk about gender roles more. I could talk about.
Well, we're getting towards the end of today's talk, and I want to see if there's any questions from behind the scenes. So let's see if anybody has any questions. So somebody said, "Oh, what about Larry? What? No, what about?"
There are no questions.
There are no questions. I don't know what that first line was. Okay, there are no questions. Okay, so
I've explained it all.
Yeah. So, well, I would love to take your class. I have to tell you. So, tell us just a little bit more about your classes. So, what are you teach all different aspects. So, you teach Hollywood, you teach comedy, you teach music, right? You have all the other.
I mean, I don't teach them all at the same time. This term I'm teaching a course on drama literature for English. So that's its own thing, and a set of plays that most of them not by Jewish writers, a few of them are. For Jewish studies, I'm teaching the first year seminar on the Jews in Hollywood. So we've just sort of been going through the moguls. And then I'm teaching the Jewish Songwriters course for the first time in a long time. And I sort of think about these things. I just showed them the beginning of the movie Showboat, right? And we talked about the ways in which Kern and Hammerstein, when they wrote that show, were trying to be progressive. And it's based on an Edna Ferber novel. And both Edna Ferber and Fanny Hurst were Jewish women who wrote novels. And those are novels where you have a young African-American woman who tries to pass as white, in both Imitation of Light and Showboat. And those characters may be metaphors for the women who wrote the books. You know, the growing up sort of assimilated as Jews, but afraid people would find out that they were Jewish, embarrassed that their family mentioned that they were Jewish. I mean, Fanny Hurst was not a great writer. You had sort of Mel Brooks writing a song, hope for the best, expect the worst. You could be Tolstoy or Fanny Hurst. You know, the idea that she's the worst writer ever, or Mike Nichols worked on a song, I'm your pate, I'm liverwurst, you're Shakespeare and I'm Fanny Hurst, sort of like the Cole Porter, baby, if I'm the bottom, you're the top. But she's not a great writer, but it's sort of interesting that those novels were made into iconic films that were made in the 30s and then remade in the 50s. And in some ways, the 30s films are more frank about racial issues and more hard-hitting than the very timid 50s remakes.
Where does your expertise go to? Like, what years? What year do you have? Like years that are really where you concentrate in the history of Jews in Hollywood?
I really, with a lot of the courses I teach, and this is also true with the Jewish science fiction course, which is a whole different kettle of fish, I kind of take people through the 20th century. So there are certain things that affect all the Jewish science fiction writers and all the songwriters and all the people involved in developing musicals and all the people in Hollywood. There's, World War I, there's the Depression, there's the Holocaust, obviously has a huge impact on Jews everywhere. There's sort of the McCarthy era and the Red Scare. And since there are a lot of Jews on the left in all these different fields, it has a huge impact on them. There's the Cultural Revolution and people being more open about their ethnic background in the 60s. So I almost feel like I'm giving students a history of the 20th century in each of these courses, even though we're looking at one particular area of artistic endeavor or entertainment. I sort of feel like that's what I mostly take them through. And then we look at a little of what's been happening in recent years, but I spend less time on that in part because they already know it. They know more about sort of pop culture and Jews and rap than I do. They don't need me to give them a class on Drake or whoever it is that they're following, or, some of these Little Dicky and people I don't, I mean, they know more than I do about the current stuff, but I can fill in the blanks for them about some of the history.
Yeah,
So
well, it's always fascinating to see where, where everything comes from and how it evolves, and it's everything speeding up so much now because of all the, because of just our society as it is. It's something interesting. I have no idea how I didn't know this, but like Rod Serling from
yeah.
the Twilight Zone was Jewish.
Right. Well, that's how I talked to how they came to me and they said, could you teach a Jewish science fiction course? And this was a time when I wasn't full-time at Vanderbilt again. After the recession, they let me go and I came back part-time, but I wanted to be full-time. And so I said, could I teach a course about Jews and science fiction? Of course. They said, is there anything besides Asimov? And I said, well, sure. And I said, there's Rod Serling, and there is. So again, it's fun for me to teach students. They've never seen an episode of The Twilight Zone before. I get to show them some good episodes.
Oh my God. And it was fascinating. I Wikipedia'd him and then started reading all about him, about how he came to be who he is and wow, that show. It was fascinating. We're getting close to running out of time, but there's a question. Can someone audit your class if you're not a Vandy student, if they're not a Vandy student?
I'm afraid you can. I think that Vanderbilt sort of very much doesn't want people coming into the classroom, maybe tripping, breaking their leg, and then suing Vanderbilt. So I think they only want people in the classes who are Vanderbilt students. I don't think people, I teach some MLAS courses, and that's for people sort of working at various places in Vanderbilt who then can sort of get a master's degree at Vanderbilt. I taught a class on creative writing, playwriting, screenwriting this summer, and it was just a pleasure with wonderful MLAS students. So those are older people and not sort of traditional Vanderbilt students. But I don't think it's possible to audit it. But again, if somebody wants to hire me to teach a course, we'll put something together.
I love that idea. I feel like, I can't wait till, we can get back into the building, fully, and our seniors and everybody. I just would love to have you. Alex is behind the scenes here, but it's just so fascinating. There's so much to dive into. And so, time is up. It just went so quickly. I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise and insight today. And maybe we can do a part 3 if you're good to go. We'll have our own little Vanderbilt program here.
I certainly schmooze. I was going to say that with Showboat, one of the things that's racist is the Hattie McDaniel character Queenie is scolding Paul Robeson and saying you're lazy, and and the idea of the strong black woman yelling at the black man. But then there's also the woman who scolds Captain Andy, who's the captain of the ship, his wife Parthy, and it's almost like Tevye and Golda. It may just be a Jewish vision of married life. It's with the wife yelling at the husband, but it can read as racist. But so all these things tie together: the gender roles and the appropriation and the representation. I would love to come back. Maybe it wouldn't be sort of billed as Jews in Hollywood. It could be about songwriters or musicals or humor or something else.
Okay, that's a deal. I'm making the deal right now. All right. So thank you again for